Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next video. In this one I want to talk and discuss Halo the TV series Season 1. The last episode, episode 9, aired yesterday. It is confirmed, I think, to be getting a Season 2, and I have wanted to talk about it. I am a Halo fan, though interestingly I got into Halo through the novels first and sort of the games second. So the story of Halo is kind of in a way what appeals to me. I like the gameplay, but the story is what is my focus when it comes to Halo. So, of course, a Halo TV series, especially because it's been in like production for so long, and it finally happened now. It was originally meant to be like a movie years and years ago. Finally, we get something. And there is value in Halo to doing this. This is not a situation where it feels like it's a pointless adaptation. There's always, just read the source material, just play the source material here. In that Halo is pretty simple in terms of like, play the games and there's novels. But that means there is value to the story being adapted into a more typical medium of, a TV series or a movie. And that's where the appeal here is in terms of like, turn a couple of these novels and those first few games into a good adaptation. And I think you'll get a lot of people into Halo and you'll make a lot of Halo fans happy. So how did they do? So full spoilers straight away. I don't really see the need to hold back on anything like that when it's a weird thing. Because we have to discuss it straight away, how they chose to do the adaptation here in terms of accuracy, where they changed things, and so on. Weirdly, it's this thing where they actually came out ahead of time and told us this show will be its own continuity. It will be the silver timeline, and they basically came out and said what you expected them to say, which is that it will feature similar elements from the main timeline that you know, but used maybe in different ways. It won't go exactly accurately, and so on. So interesting. There's not too many, I think, things that I've seen before where ahead of an adaptation they've literally come out and said and made a statement about continuity and saying it's its own continuity. Don't complain about this show when it comes out because it's different. So straight away, I think you get the idea going into this, that they knew that this was going to be a little bit of a problem. They felt the need to be somewhat defensive about this because they were going to make changes that they probably knew people wouldn't like. What's weird about it is that it's like 60 to 70% like similar to the main continuity in terms of like the main beats of what is actually happening are the same. It's just a lot of the details, the scenes that they show to get across this story are where they make changes, and it makes a big difference because it's Master Chief as the kind of leader of the Spartans. They're part of the UNSC who are fighting the Covenant in this war for survival that's been going on for a certain amount of time. There's like insurrectionists in there also on the humanity side of things. And the thing that is going to sort of change the war is the discovery and when we eventually get to the first Halo ring. They're the main sort of elements of Halo, and they are accurate in this and accurate in that. But so many of the details along the way are super important in terms of execution, presentation, and that's where this show begins to sort of fall apart a little bit. My general thoughts on this show are that I think it's okay. I don't think it's awful, but I also don't think it's particularly amazing. I enjoyed watching these episodes, but I also didn't necessarily feel like I had to, the day the new episode released, get to it straight away. I wasn't that hyped, for each episode. I was fine with, I can't get to it this day, so I'll just wait until tomorrow. And, that's just the way it is. Which is a little unfortunate that they only managed to make it just about okay, when it could have been so much more. And I think so much of my review score here, which is basically somewhere like 6.5 out of 10, which is still good, leaning towards the positive, but there's enough negatives that you have to talk about the criticisms of the show. I end up feeling like nearly every criticism I have fundamentally comes back to, well, yeah, you made this weird decision to change things here and present this in this weird way. Whereas if you were just accurate to the main continuity, you would have done it better. And it just constantly comes up, and it's like, sure, you have this thing where it's its own continuity. You're trying to avoid that criticism of like, it's bad because it's different. But in a lot of the cases, it is the case where the new show, what you changed, what you added in, isn't very good. And it's the case where even if they have a sort of interesting idea that's new, they don't even execute it very well. So I think fundamentally the writing is where this show has its problems. Otherwise, I think the production is actually quite good in that I have a lot of confidence in a lot of the cast members here, that if they were given better content, they could execute very well on these characters. And the costumes, the CG when they use it, is very good. It feels like everything is there to make a really, really good Halo show if they stuck closer to the main continuity. And notice that I said closer there, not 100% exact accurately. And that's always going to be the issue when it comes to these things. How close do you go? When is a change fine versus when is a change pushing things too far? It's always going to be very difficult to do that, especially when, in this case, like, this era of Halo is mainly adapting like novels. And then we're eventually, I suppose, more towards the end of season 2, whenever they get there, they'll be more jumping into sort of adapting the Halo 1 material. So at this stage of the story, they probably have to cut a lot of stuff because they don't have enough time to page by page accurately adapt the novel. But what they chose to add in, take out, is kind of very weird. My fundamental major criticism, the thing I think about in nearly every episode of this show as to what I think one of the major problems is that I don't think they did a good enough job at establishing the world, just what's happening in this universe at this point in time. The core world building of Halo is not there, and I feel like if I wasn't a Halo fan and I knew the core premise of Halo, I would feel a little bit lost, because it is humanity at war with the Covenant. They tell you that, but they never really show you that. It never feels like humanity, if the UNSC fall apart, that humanity itself will fall in days. The stakes never feel that high. And part of that is that they barely ever show the Covenant. And the show makes the decision to have this human character, Makee, more or less represent the Covenant in most of the plot through this season. They're still out there doing their thing while Makee is doing her things. It is separate to a certain degree, but they definitely do rely on the core premise of, here is a human character who was raised by the Covenant, and she will get across a lot of the stuff with them. And so we never really get across just how dangerous the Covenant necessarily is. Because what's weird about it is that in the 3 major action scenes that you have, one at the start, one at the end, and one in the middle, it's good. It's a Halo action and it works. But you can tell they maybe didn't have the budget to use the Covenant that much in the show. And that's why kind of Makee has to be here. Because for whatever reason, like we can't have a main character who is just CG. We can't have a main Sangheili character. We can't have a main Sanshayum character, Prophet. Now, Regret and Mercy are there, but they definitely feel like they're in the background as just like, okay, they're overall the leaders, but it's Makee who's the focus. And that's where like the sort of almost limitations of the show feel like they're in here, in that the stuff Makee adds does not feel like it counters what was lost in giving so much of that screen time to her and not to more action scenes with the Covenant. I think they needed to just do what they do in effectively the opening scene of Fall of Reach. I think that this is probably a much more effective thing to do than what they do here, which is have the Spartans come in and kind of like win the fight on the ground, but then be called to retreat because they're losing the fight in space. And immediately you get across the idea of like, humanity can hold their own on the ground, but they lose the technological battle against the Covenant. And you have to have them watch a planet be glassed. And then you go into the Spartan backstory. That's why the Fall of Reach, the book, is so good, because it just tells the story in a really good way. Here, they try to overcomplicate things by having it be like, oh, it's an insurrectionist planet, Madrigal, and they're fighting, and it's the Covenant attack them, and then the UNSC come in to help them, and it's just like, what's going on here? Why are we focused on the insurrectionists at this point when we're like 10 plus years into a war with the Covenant? They never explain any of the details about how this situation really came about, which I do think is a bit of a problem. I think you did need backstory on what the status of things is. And it feels like, in a way, like, is this show meant to be for new people, or is this for Halo fans? Because it feels like there's so much that they almost expect you to just be aware of because you know what Halo is. And this is where they needed to definitely focus more in on that transition point and use the Spartan program as the core point, like they do in the Fall of Reach, which is you show the kids being sort of found by Halsey and Keyes. You focus on, obviously, John, and you introduce the concept of like luck with him. That's like his skill in a way. And then you show the fact that, okay, you've kidnapped all these kids. This is the start of the Spartan program. And while this is happening, you're getting the reasoning for why this program is in place. That we're not at war with the Covenant yet. The Spartan program is implemented to fight against the insurrectionists. And this way you actually develop the insurrectionists more than you do even by having them here in this show. And you at least highlight that, oh, here's a little bit of a dark side of the UNSC, that, you know, there's conflict in humanity before the aliens even arrive. And the reason the Spartans are ready to go when the Covenant do attack is because they were prepared for something else. But the PR is better now because we have the super soldiers to fight the aliens who are like dominant. And it's all about, I think, in this show, like the presentation. This show feels like in almost every single scene, like it has to tell you how many shades of grey the UNSC have. Look how dark what they're doing is. Look how terrible the UNSC are. They're brainwashing the Spartans. And it's not just that, like, they created this batch of super soldiers because they needed something better. It's, they did that, and this, and this, and this. And all of the leaders are arguing with each other and sort of out for each other's jobs and trying to get each other kind of removed and all of this stuff. They just were unwilling to present the UNSC in any sort of a like decent light, given that this is the organization that is organizing the defense of humanity against a group of aliens that want to wipe humanity out for reasons that are not particularly known right now. And because of that, I felt like they just missed the mark by not explaining at a core level what the conflict between humanity and the Covenant is about, because it never felt like it was humanity fighting for its survival. There's little bits and pieces on the sidelines that kind of get that across, that like they're referencing a glassed planet, but we never really jump in and see that. Like I was saying, that's why the start of Fall of Reach is so good, is because you see straight away the idea of like the Spartans are super effective, but there's only so much they can do. That humanity is slowly losing ground in this war. These planets are gradually falling and getting obliterated by the Covenant. And there's a need for something to change. And it changes with the discovery of the Halo ring, because it's obviously something both sides want. but it's also a pathway to discovering more of like the ancient history, and eventually obviously introducing the Flood, introducing the Forerunners, and getting more into the sort of galactic scale Halo and like mantle of responsibility, and which species earns it and deserves it, and so on. And there's elements of that here because this is like a 2020s Halo project. They have the benefit of being able to look at all of the lore that has been in place for Halo for all this time. So they should actually theoretically be able to do an adaptation that does things slightly differently by reordering things and like bringing up stuff that was introduced later on. And they do elements of that. Like, I actually think one of the more effective things is Soren being introduced and actually being one of the main characters as like a, you know, Spartan dropout, someone who left, and that he is sort of the way that he changes these Spartans, at least John. That's like okay, even though I don't really like the way they changed the details surrounding the Spartan augmentations in this show. The use of Soren here as being something more than what he was in the main continuity, which is effectively still the same thing, but it was just a short story to highlight this, and then we move on. But this is where we get into, like, in this show, that's all they felt the need to really cover for the Spartan program. That all they went into on the Spartan program here is the negatives of it. And without showing like the camaraderie between the other Spartans, which I think was needed to cover like the idea of why all the Spartans are connected, which they really got across, I suppose, reasonably well in the last episode. Before that, I don't think you quite had it. Show the camaraderie between all the Spartans. Another point, why is there only 4 Spartans, or 5 if you include Soren? Where's the others? What's going on there? Like, there's some weirdness there. Similarly, why is it Silver Team and why isn't it just Blue Team? Why is the team makeup effectively the same as Blue Team, but they're all different names? I don't really know. It just feels like changes for the sake of changes. When Kai feels effectively like Kelly. Riz does effectively feel like Linda. And Vanek, we could roughly make the case that he's sort of like Fred. Why make that change? It just seems very unnecessary to go to such lengths to make a relatively minor change for no real reason. Because if you're going to do that, then why even have the Master Chief? Why not have the main character be a different Spartan? That way, people are much more okay with what you're doing. And this gets back to that idea, like I said at the start, that, you know, by choosing to do this thing where it's like 60 to 70% the same general content, you've basically chosen the worst possible like ratio. You haven't gone super accurate to the point where like people are nitpicking when they criticize the little changes you do make. You also haven't gone in the other direction where it's so different that you are grasping at straws and basically making kind of pointless criticism to say it's different when, well, obviously, like, there's nothing that's like particularly similar. By doing it somewhere in the middle, they've completely opened themselves up to the criticisms here, because it feels like every decision is, this would have been better if you did it accurately. The new stuff that you did doesn't feel that great, in that I don't think you've written the new thing well enough to justify why it's not done differently or isn't done in the canon accurate way. Just really, really confusing. Some other points while we're going here. The Master Chief and the portrayal. I like the actor that they have to play the Master Chief. I think the look is fine. I don't mind that he takes his helmet off and that they show his face. But I think they take it to an extreme. The amount of time he isn't wearing his armor or doesn't have his helmet on. They don't need to make this like The Mandalorian, where it's a rarity when you see his face. I'm okay with the idea that you want the actor to actually get a chance to act without having the helmet on. I'm not like obsessed with the idea of like, oh, acting with the helmet on and the emotions that you can show with just the helmet. I don't really like get that. In this case, like I do think they took it to extremes by like he barely ever has the helmet on, and there are so many scenes where he's not even wearing any of his armor. It's just that like extremes of like, you don't need to go as far as the Mandalorian, but where you went here was way too much. Like, I'm okay with like he in like 90% of the scenes he's wearing most of his armor, but I'm okay with like his face being shown like a reasonable amount. It's just there's a few scenes where it feels like the characters, even the other Spartans, take their helmets off and then immediately are injured in some way because they took their helmet off and weren't wearing their helmet. And it's just like, what are you doing? Like, what's the point of that? The arc of the Master Chief, I think, is basically impacted purely on how they choose to do the presentation of the Spartan training, the details surrounding what the kids do and do not know about what happened to them, the way they choose to alter the way the augmentations work in this version of it, all to make it so that like the Master Chief has a very like dramatic and intense reaction to what happened. And I can see the appeal from a writer looking at the lore of Halo and trying to really make a character arc for the Master Chief at this point and feeling like, well, you have this thing built in, like why not reveal what the Spartan program is about to him and have him react to that, when in the main continuity they have like a couple of like random Spartans be more of the ones who have more of a reaction to what happened to them. It takes the approach of most of the kids know they were kidnapped, but because they sort of see the value in a way of like, you know, Halsey gives in the main canon, like Halsey gives a speech to all the kidnapped kids when they arrive back at Reach, and she roughly kind of gets them to like see the value in what this mission to make them soldiers actually is. And while it's still terrible that like everything that's been done here, it's still very much this dark thing that Halsey had to do, that the UNSC had to approve to fight the insurrectionists, but now they value because they're here to fight the Covenant. They get across the idea that there is a incredible camaraderie between the Spartans. So many friendships were formed during their training together. And I think not showing any of that and actively only showing negative aspects to it just doesn't help. Like I said, with the way the UNSC is portrayed, it just kind of feels like it's a bit over the top. I'm all for like getting across some of these shades of grey, but when you literally aren't really going to like address much of them until after the war is over, I'm not really sure what the point necessarily is in it. When, yeah, the like Chief, they all know that they've been, you know, kidnapped, but they learn to adapt to their situation that's been happening here. It's not that their memories of their past have been restricted or anything like that. It's not that their emotions necessarily have been tampered with like they do here. It makes it seem very extreme what happens here, where they are actively being like borderline mind controlled in this version of the show, because they have this kind of like, what is it, like was a hormone like dampener type thing in their back that makes them just like zombies almost. And how blunt a lot of the high-ups in the UNSC are about the idea of controlling the Spartans, whereas in the main continuity there's no real question about like controlling the Spartans, because they are just a military unit that is part of the UNSC. They are an asset like any other part of the military to be used when needed. Their loyalty is because they're part of the UNSC. Whereas it feels like there's this whole thing here where they more try to be like, we've turned them into like amazing weapons. What if those weapons are turned against us? And again, I see maybe the value in that you can maybe look at the way it's done in canon and feel that it's it's maybe very convenient that the kids kind of are roughly accepting of what happens to them, even though it's very dark. But I think if you read The Fall of Reach, it's really well done the way that those scenes work, because they cover why the chief is the leader, and they show him interacting with a lot of the other Spartans when they were younger. And so when you get around to stuff like, you know, augmentations and the Spartans that they lose because of the augmentations failing and so on, there is emotion to it, and you can see that what he's lost in his family from when he was younger, his actual family, he's gained in terms of this new family of Spartans, and that most of the Spartans are ultimately fine with having this sort of drive and goal presented towards them, where they can be the sort of, you know, protectors of humanity. They have a reason to that they can be useful because they're Spartans and they're the best unit in the military, effectively, and they value that. And this show really lingers on the idea of just, I suppose, the drama of absolutely everything. And I felt like they just needed to pull it back a little bit. Just be willing to have scenes with the UNSC where it's just a functioning military, and it's not all about these dark things that is going on here. And again, this is where the fact that they didn't cover how serious the threat of the Covenant is, and it doesn't really come across that well, really affects the show, to the point where it makes the UNSC, I think, look way worse than it maybe actually is. So that was just weird presentation to me. And then with regards to the whole, like, the way they're presented after that, it makes it kind of a bit odd the way, like, John and Kai are when they do remove the thing from their back, and they're just, like, amazed by everything. Like, it's a bit over the top about how they go from almost being in this, like, daze of just being military people to all of a sudden they're like, the beauty of the world and all of this sort of stuff. Like, their emotions have just been awakened for the first time ever. Whereas the way they're presented in, like, the main canon is that, yeah, they're serious, they're focused, they don't tend to talk a lot, but they do have personalities. It's just that their personalities only tend to come out around each other. So the comms chatter between the different Spartan groups, that's where their personalities come out. And you get the relationships that do begin to develop when the chief is, like, around other characters for longer periods of time. That's what I think interesting. And again, what it feels like ultimately is that the writers felt like, this is too subtle. We need more drama. We need more hashtag drama in this show. So let's make it so that it's this very extreme thing. The UNSC are directly controlling the actions of the Spartans and going as far as to, like, in those early episodes when, like, the whole Master Chief goes rogue thing happened and they, like, remotely cut off the air on the ship to basically, like, knock him out. And then the fact that, like, Cortana in this show can actively, like, take over Chief's mind. And that is actually what they do in the final episode, where Master Chief is like, John is kind of quote unquote gone, and it is just Cortana in control of him. What? I thought the last episode was actually pretty good overall, but this one decision just to me was baffling to end on that note and whatever they were going for. That one of the most clear-cut, obvious dynamics to do, Master Chief and Cortana, and their back and forth communicating to each other with, like, Cortana in Chief's head, but them both being able to communicate, and you literally take that away? What are you doing? Especially because you had to wait until effectively the start of this last episode to even get, or was it the end of episode 8, to get scenes where it is Cortana giving Chief so much more extra tactical information than he otherwise would have had, properly being the sort of like AI helper that we know her as. To go in that direction, I just thought was so weird. Because I actually liked that they showed a little bit more of sort of how she was made, and that stuff that when it's written in text of like, oh yeah, Cortana is actually made from a cloned copy of Halsey's brain, they literally just explain it like that in the books. But it's very different actually seeing Halsey basically look at herself, knowing that she's going to effectively kill this copy of herself to get the brain so that Cortana can be made. That actually has a little bit more impact. But then they go and make Cortana this like whole other thing where because they're so obsessed with the UNSC controlling the Spartans that she is put in there to literally take control of his body, which is not necessarily what it's meant to be about. I much more prefer the canon version of this, which is that like Cortana and Halsey have this like relationship where like Cortana like chooses Master Chief because she believes that like he's the most effective Spartan, and that she will add so much more on top of what how great he already is, compared to like this weird thing of like, and now take over his body, and now Cortana shut his mind off so we can stop him. It's just like, what? Because again, Halsey, the actress, I thought did a reasonable job of portraying her. It's just that I think, again, they went too far down the dramatic road of making her like feel heartless and like emotionless, when there was the canonical Halsey is a much more like nuanced character, especially in these early kind of points. Speaking of which, Keyes. Why would you just present Keyes as just being another one of the high-ups in the UNSC? When you read the books, Keyes is cool and interesting because he is this really talented captain, and you have like the Keyes loop maneuver and him proving himself in the lead up to, you know, why he's given the position as captain of like the Pillar of Autumn, leading into the events of Halo 1. That's all really cool, and there's the option to, I suppose, go back to that and do that eventually. But I think they made a mistake here by making him too like heavily involved in everything, whereas the books sort of make the case that like he is only minorly, I guess, sure, minorly involved with the whole Spartan thing at the start, and that he's there for the interviews, but is out before a lot of the really bad stuff actually happens. And so Keyes can actually be this actually quite interesting character. Here I just think that they took away so many of the interesting parts, and it felt like in the end he's no different than like the way they're basically portraying Parangovsky in this one or anything like that. Just very weird. The insurrectionist stuff with Quan Ha, ultimately like pretty boring, but maybe some interesting lore stuff beginning to come in towards the end of that arc, with the way they did the ancestors thing and the significance of Madrigal, and there's basically like a portal, I guess, to the Halo on Madrigal. I'm guessing what they're doing here is that they will play on the idea of Quan Ha's like ancestry goes back to like maybe like the original people who were put back on Madrigal to like reseed the galaxy after the Halo rings fired in the first place, or something like that. I'm thinking that's kind of what they're going for here, of when they finally get around to revealing all the stuff about the Forerunners and them firing the Halo rings to take out the Flood, and the galaxy needing to be reseeded, that yeah, that's, I think, part of the direction they're going to go in. Otherwise, like, not great overall. Like, a lot of that episode, what was it, episode maybe 6 or 7 or something like that, was very slow, and just the idea of like a whole episode focused on this character didn't really work for me. They need to do a lot more to get across why I should care about this character. And again, the whole, why are you focusing on insurrectionist stuff when you're not actually explaining a lot of the events that actually are set into motion by like the Spartan program and stuff like that. You're not explaining effectively like the origins of the insurrectionist or anything. They're just here because they need to be here, I guess. Okay. There's that. So I suppose that leads us into McKee, who basically with her and John, Master Chief, they introduced the idea of like the Blessed Ones, and effectively they are like the quote-unquote reclaimers for this show. Instead of it being like all of humanity is capable of operating Forerunner technology, they established that only select special people can. And so I think we get that in that, what, Quan, I think, tries to touch it. She can't activate it. Does Kai touch it, I think, as well? There's a few of the other main cast members who do touch the artifact and it doesn't work. So it highlights, okay, John is special, McKee is special because they can activate it. And that's interesting enough. But they do rely quite heavily on this plot point, and the whole 2 parts of the artifact thing is like a major thing to find the Halo ring. And it's fine. I just fundamentally don't really get why you need to change it so much. I prefer the way that they do it in like the books, which is that like they're fleeing and like Cortana activates these, you know, kind of coordinates that she got from effectively like other kind of Forerunner-esque things, and they happen to like, you know, jump in next to the Halo ring, and that's the setup for Halo 1. I'm okay with that being somewhat random. You don't need to go massively in depth on like, here is the map to get to the thing that will show us where the Halo ring is, and then we'll have to make our way out to that place as well. And it's like, come on, like we know what we're doing here. The Halo ring, we're trying to get there. It's fine. I understand. And so there was definitely an element of that that was just like, come on. I honestly was surprised that we didn't end this season with like the Halo ring like right there in a way, like to set up season 2 to effectively be Halo 1. But we'll get there, I assume. But yeah, like, because there was that episode where we went back to like what John's home planet, and I thought that episode was surprisingly like boring. The amount of time of just like him walking around the house, slowly remembering things, and it's like, I see what you're trying to do here, because you really, really seem to love the idea of what if one of the Spartans finds out that they were kidnapped. It just feel like do this later on. Like, get the basics of Halo down first before you get here. I just wasn't connecting with that one, even though it was the show trying to have an arc for the main character. I just, for some reason, I'm not really connecting with the idea that like it's John who we're doing the discovers the Spartan program thing with. I don't feel like super strongly about. So that one wasn't great. McKee herself, like, I like aspects of her character with regards to like, she actually is in a terrible position before the Covenant arrive, and so to her, she's sort of like saved from an even crueler situation like by the Covenant. And even though like they don't treat her like amazingly well, they have to have a like, you know, a begrudging sort of level of respect to her because she is a, you know, blessed one. And the problem with how they use her is that they do basically use her as the representative of the Covenant for most of the series, in that the UNSC never properly communicates or interacts with any of the like Covenant characters on an individual level, really, except her. But even then, because of the arc that they do with her, and she effectively, quote unquote, turns on the Covenant for the most part, because she, you know, falls in love with John, even that doesn't quite work. So again, it's just very drama-y here of like, instead of just committing to the character just being loyal to the Covenant, but she's a human, you had to try and do the turn her back arc, but then you never quite committed to it because she herself, in the end, like the big problem is that she believes in the Great Journey like the Covenant do. And so she doesn't want to let go of that artifact connection that sort of previews the Halo to them. And you get that kind of dramatic scene at the end where Kai is forced to shoot Makee to stop the connection to bring Chief back onto the battlefield. You know, a reasonably nice dramatic moment set up. It's just, what am I meant to feel about this scene? And that, like, this sudden, almost random romance that you did between John and Makee, like, what are we doing here? And that's the thing with this show, is just that it felt like, as much as you are using aspects of the lore here, so much of the way this show is written feels like the writers had a fundamental lack of confidence in the main plot of Halo to work, unless they like jazzed it up with a bit more drama and, you know, spice or whatever. And so much of it just felt like out of place. Like you were trying to turn this into a show like one of those other ones out there, instead of letting this be this proper, you know, sci-fi show that actually has really good stuff to it. It's not just because it's a popular video game and stuff like that. No, it has a good story. Let it shine. And they just didn't really make that happen. I think that covers a lot of what I wanted to talk about here. Like I said more towards the start, I don't super dislike this show or anything, but I do definitely interpret a lot of what they were doing with the whole continuity stuff as feeling like this is our shield to defend the show with. That stop complaining that it's not identical. We told you it's not going to be the same. But I think when you say that, us giving you the idea of like, okay, you can make changes, has to come with the idea of either, one, prove to me your changes are good by the show being good and those changes adding to things. Or if I don't feel they work, explain to me why you made that change. Because otherwise it just feels like you made a change for the sake of it, or you weren't confident in the main material and you felt that you had to do it. I'm not sure what the actual answer is with a lot of what they actually did, but it does feel like the show was at its best when it felt like accurate main continuity Halo, and the show was at its worst when it was doing a lot of the newer things that were introduced. And that may not be every single like example of that, but a lot of it to me certainly felt that way. That the side plot with Kwan Ha on her own, not great. A lot of the Makee stuff, not great. And guess what? Those are two of the major new additions to this. And they are where so much of the stuff where it just didn't quite work. Whereas, you know, the Halsey stuff is like, okay, you changed some stuff around here, but overall it's solid. And in general, I'm liking what they're doing. The Master Chief, again, you changed some stuff, but overall, pretty good. The other Spartans, again, like, you changed their names and stuff like that, but like, okay. And especially like when they do the action, the 3 main action scenes that we had were great. And everyone was praising them. And it felt like that's what we had over the course of the show with regards to the reaction for it. It's like, what is this show doing? What is this show doing? Oh, cool, Halo action that actually feels like what exactly I want from this show. And then they get back to more plot-focused stuff, and it's like, what are you doing again? But hey, action, you know? Just weirdness start to finish. And part of the reason why I wanted to do this video was I wanted to discuss something that like was doing a live-action adaptation coming up, because my channel's mainly Avatar, and we're getting a Netflix live action Avatar show coming up in the next, I guess, year or so. And I'm very interested to see how it takes its approach to doing an adaptation, and where they're going to, be accurate or be inaccurate. Now, with the Avatar show, they know what not to do because of the failure of the Last Airbender M. Night Shyamalan movie. But what will they change? Because they're going to have to do some adaptation changes. And it's just another example of, like, to me, the Halo one struggled in the writing department when it came to the adaptation. Everything else seems fine. It's just the writing. And what is the one thing with the live action Avatar show that we don't know about yet? It's those type of decision makings. What they have left in, what they've left out, what are they changing or not? That's what we don't know. But so far, like, the cast looks good. The technology that they're using to make the show looks decent. They've got a good kind of CG graphics studio involved. It all seems like it's coming together on that front, which is the same here, where, like, a lot of the technical aspects work. The scripts, writing, stuff like that, that's where it really fell apart. So they're my thoughts on the Halo live action show. Again, we'll see how it goes with season 2. I don't even know what's coming out. I don't really plan to do, like, individual episode reviews, so probably the next time you'll see another one of these videos will be after the end of season 2 of the Halo show. But just in the comments, if you have watched the show, what are your thoughts on it and how it did things, as well as what I had to say about the show. But other than that, that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.